Welcome to these lectures on the 4th century. In the previous slides and lecture, you would have heard about the 5th century, which also forms part of the classical era. The classical period really featured a landmark, or watermark as it were, with the end of the Peloponnesian War, whereas the 5th century was positioned or marked by a bipolar, as it were, situation with Sparta and Athens really holding the reins to the dominance over the Greek mainland and the Aegean, interspersed with some Persian interference. The 4th century was a lot more fragmented, with different coalitions rising, different powers being in control, with the Persian king re-emerging in full force and taking control over the Aegean once again, and finally the rise of Macedon as an established and dominant power in the Greek mainland, contrary to what was the case beforehand. As mentioned before, the Peloponnesian War saw the rise of Sparta as the ultimate power. They dominated the Athenians, they defeated them, subjugated them, and turned them into a Spartan enclave, an ally, as it were. But soon after, democratic exiles found their way into the homes of former Spartan allies such as Thebes, Argos, and Corinth, and from there recaptured Athens and established a new democracy. And from then on, Athens quickly re-established itself as a dominant power again in the 4th century, despite the significant population losses they incurred during the Peloponnesian War. And part of that comes through the expansion of democracy and the cultural program in Athens. We can see that in various ways through the incorporation or integration of a more varied group of people participating in the democracy, and also in various ways throughout Attica in the refurbishment of sanctuaries and the integration or introduction of new cults throughout Athens and Attica as well. Well, shortly after the Peloponnesian War, Sparta found itself in a hegemonial position, but that doesn't last too long, or at least some form of friction is quickly rising. As mentioned before, Athenian democratic exiles find their way to former Spartan allies, and from this collaboration, the seeds of an alliance start to take shape that will try and aim to bring down the Spartans. And this alliance consists of Argos, Corinth, but more importantly, Thebes and Athens, and they're being sponsored by the Persian king, amongst others, who is wary of the expanding Spartan Empire in Asia Minor as well, under Agesilaus, who's creating or enacting upon a pan-Hellenist expedition there. And by supporting dissidents within the Greek mainland, the Persian king can basically ensure that the Spartans leave his territories alone by enabling or causing a proxy war, as it were, in the Greek mainland. That's only part of the equation. Spartan abrasive behavior towards their allies certainly kindled a fire there as well. And slowly but surely, this alliance starts a war against the Spartans, also known as the Corinthian War. This lasts from 395 until 386, when it ends with the king's peace. And that's sort of ironic that a war started by the Persian king ends up being decided by him as well. But in this case, it wasn't because of direct involvement, but because he shifted his weight behind the Spartans near the end of the conflict, and therefore ensured that the Spartans would come out victorious. And this was also because the rising Athenian power, especially in the Aegean after some naval victories, started to worry the Persian king of a renewed Athenian empire. More importantly, this king's peace established the notion of autonomia and ensured that no other polis could dominate another one. Well, at least in the eyes of the Spartans, of course, because they still dominated the Helots and other areas, but it was a very useful tool to disable the Thebans and their bullish koinon, since this was now disrupted and atomized, as it were, into separate Polis. And after that, the rise of Thebes coincides with more abrasive behavior by the Spartans. The Spartans create a coup, as it were, in Thebes, and the result from that coup is a renewed Athenian collaboration, this time leading to the decimation of Sparta, especially with the final battle of Leuctra in 371, which sort of eviscerates any lingering notion of Spartan superiority, and it starts a new cycle of coalition wars, this time between Athens and the Thebans. But more importantly, the winners from this conflict or from this arrangement are the Persians and later on the Macedonians, who make their entry in the 350s. So in these 50 years, this half century, we see a shift in hegemons within Greece, starting with the Spartans, then being followed by the Boeotians and their koinon, and finally ending with the Macedonians and their king, Philip, as the ultimate leader. And in the meanwhile, the Persian king reclaimed Asia Minor to himself and ensured that no more Greeks would come his way except as mercenaries. As mentioned before, the Spartans lost their hegemony at Leuctra in Boeotia in 371, which is around here, through Thebes and the Boeotian koinon, which is located here, and they massively defeated the Spartans in Leuctra. It was a crushing defeat for the Spartans, but that wasn't the end of it. Thebes and the Boeotian koinon, led by the brilliant Epaminondas and Pelopidas, both excellent generals, great orators, and philosophers in their own right, started to eviscerate any vestiges of Spartan power in the Peloponnese by establishing an independent B.C.E, for instance, right here. The Helots were freed, as well as detaching any remaining Spartan allies in the Peloponnese. And afterwards they turned their attention to the Athenians, but it was a different sort of relationship, and definitely they weren't as successful in dismantling or eviscerating Athenian power as they were with the Spartans. Either way, their dominance over Greece was established after Leuctra, but it lasted for a short while. In 362, there was a battle at Mantinea that really didn't decide much except create a lot of casualties on both sides. And this is where Epaminondas dies as well. And then the Thebans continued to be the main force for a while in central Greece too, and which leads to the Sacred War of Delphi, where the Phocians confiscate sacred property from the sanctuary, leading to an accusation within their victini, and the Athenians then side with the Phocians against the Thebans, and again it's a war that bogs down into nothing, with nobody really establishing themselves as a dominant power, and this gives rise to Macedon as another player in this. Macedon, or Macedonia hereto, had really not played any significant role within Greek politics. One could even say it was a sort of cultural backwater, although that would be quite harsh. Either way, it was mostly known for its resources such as wood, great for building ships, and this also led to renewed or actually continuous Athenian intermingling in their affairs. But Macedon was also different from many other Greek areas of polis, that it had a hereditary kingship. And normally that led to kingship falling from father to son, but since most Macedonian kings had several sons, this often led to a succession war, which allowed other powers such as the Athenians or the Thebans to intervene and establish their own leader on the throne. One such example happened in the 360s as well, with the Thebans intervening and taking Philip of Macedon as hostage to Thebes, and he certainly got his revenge later on. More importantly, it was also a kingship that was not dominant or strong enough to rule over the rest of their peers. So many of these peers were just as powerful as the king, which ensured there was never really one dominant force in Macedonia. In addition, it was also a vassal state of Persia for half a century, which ensured that it didn't play that much of a role within Greek politics. But this changed with Philip of Macedon, a brilliant leader, a great strategist, and a wily and clever, skillful diplomat who used both of these skill sets to his greatest advantage. As mentioned before, he was a hostage in Thebes after the Thebans had intervened in the Macedonian succession crisis before Philip. But more importantly, Philip's reforms of Macedonia transformed this once backwater or toy of external powers into the dominant force of Greek politics. One part of that was through clever diplomacy, marrying the right people, establishing relationships with his peers and other neighboring rulers, and in this way creating a larger empire and a stable border politics, as it were, with friendly, benign relationships with the neighboring polities. But more importantly, his military reforms established the Macedonians as the crack army of the 4th century. And that was partially to do through the integration or establishment of the sarissa, the long spear, which created a different sort of formation that could engage with enemy lines from a much further distance than the regular phalanx. But also by creating a standing army that he could pay for a year, since most Greek polis had an amateur army that could only train and fight together some parts of the year, thus creating an army that surpassed any of its peers within Greece in terms of professionality and training. And he used that military and that diplomacy to great skill and force, as we can see from this map that sort of shows the expansion of Macedonian power, which was quite incredible within 17 years. So from a small kingdom on the northern shores of the Aegean, Macedon quickly expanded east and westwards and southwards in a sense as well, for instance, by incorporating Thessaly during the aforementioned Sacred War. And Thessaly brought with it prestige, resources, and more importantly, one of the crack forces of ancient Greece, its cavalry. And combined with the military reforms of Macedon and the Macedonian and Thessalian cavalry, Philip basically had an army at his disposal that was unparalleled anywhere else in the Greek world. More importantly, through marriages, he got himself interposed within Molossia, which is right here, thus expanding his empire, as well as his skillful domination of Thrace and the Hellespont. And in Thrace there were many gold mines, which further helped Philip establish his rule and strengthen his grasp over his kingdom and keep his soldiers happy with continuous pay. And also the grasp over the Hellespont brought Athens to its knees through its control over the grain supply coming in from the Black Sea. Wherever necessary, though, Philip did not really avoid capital punishment or fierce punishment if necessary, as can be shown through Olintos on the Chalkidiki, which is around here, which rose in resistance to Macedonian rule, or at least resisted it long enough, also applying to Athens for help, but then found itself on the receiving end of Philip's armies, who burned the city down to the ground, as we can see here, which left a great archaeological legacy, but was surely not as convenient or great for many of its inhabitants. And it thus shows that Philip was capable of using the carrot with allies or other states that were lenient or friendly towards him, but certainly had no issue showing the sword to those who resisted him. The destruction of Olythos in 346 also coincides with the end of the aforementioned Sacred War, leading to the peace of Philocrates, but it was a much despised peace, even within Athens, although they came away with a relatively easy peace treaty as compared to other participants in the Sacred War. And as a result, there was a strong disagreement, friction as well within the Athenian polis about how to pursue foreign policy. The strongest opponent of Philip was definitely Demosthenes, also known for his Philippica, in which he argues against reconciliation with Philip and instead urges the Athenians to rise to their ancient standards and fight the barbarian dominator, as it were. And on the other side was Socrates, an orator and writer, prolific writer, one would say, who actually engaged with Philip and saw in him the great pan-Hellenic leader the Greeks had so long yearned for, who could lead them to a victory over the Persian Empire. Although Socrates and others like him were not were dominant enough to create a friction, or at least two camps within the Athens, Philip's actions, especially in the Fourth Sacred War, which broke out in 340, worried other Greek polis as well, and increasingly and gradually Demosthenes took over Athenian politics, who became more influential, leading to a coalition led by the Thebans and their Boeotian Koinon, joining with the Athenians against Philip in 339. This coalition then confronts Philip at Chaeronea in Boeotia, and they're led by the Boeotian Koinon, but it ends in defeat. And the monument you see on the left, the Lion Memorial, was set up for the deceased Theban sacred band, one of the most elite warrior units in Greece at that time. And more importantly, the defeat of the Boeotian Athenian coalition ends the independent foreign policy period for polis in the Greek mainland. So from then on, they always had to take Macedonia into consideration and its armies and its gold, and could no longer pursue a fully independent foreign policy course, since they always had to ensure compliance with the Macedonians. Well, in 336 BC, Philip is assassinated at a wedding, his own, ironically, and his son Alexander the Great succeeds him as king, which subsequently leads to the conquest of the Persian Empire, this long-cherished pan-Hellenic dream, and the spread of Hellenic culture, as it were, across the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia. And in 323 BC, Alexander succumbs to a disease in Babylon, thereby ending the classical period and starting the Hellenistic one. But his death is celebrated in a weird way, as it were, by revolts across mainland Greece, including one in Athens. They fight the Macedonian power in hopes of re-establishing their past independence, but they fail and are subdued and subjugated by Macedonian kings, and the democracy is also put on hold, as it were, in Athens after that. And you see, after 300, most of the democracy still functions, but it heavily depends on financial support of the elite, and it becomes more of an interesting arena where you could display wealth and your involvement in the polis, as opposed to its political workings as it was before in the 5th and especially 4th century, where it involved a larger swath of the population. And with it, this includes the end of the classical period and also the end of this lecture show about the 4th century.